All right, episode 2, Brackets and Buzz. Let's get it. I'm Randall Ledet Jr., Hunter Zeisman here. This is a sub-series from the new SEC podcast where we talk nothing but college football playoff talk. Ooh, rankings came out last night, and I'm excited to talk about them. Hunter, what stood out to you?
Big thing, got a couple movers. We got Miami dropping big with a loss to Georgia Tech. BYU stepping right up to 6. I think they should be higher, which we can talk about a little bit, but Ole Miss making their way up. SEC's got 9 teams in there. Shout out South Carolina. We've been talking about it for weeks. Get them ranked, sitting at 21. So there's some good stuff from the SEC and really a lot of conferences making moves.
Definitely a lot of good stuff from the SEC. You talked about South Carolina getting ranked coming off of a win, Missouri getting ranked coming off of a win. Unfortunately, LSU lost, so they dropped down to 22, but still 9 ranked SEC teams. And, what stood out to me is there's 4 of the top 5 are from the Big Ten. Yeah. So a lot of that stuff will play itself out with Ohio State playing Indiana here in the next couple of weeks. And, of course, Oregon will probably play in the conference championship game, so that'll probably change up the rankings as we move forward. But what I love about these rankings is that they're a true snapshot of what the committee thinks are the best teams in the country right now. And if that's how they're truly treating it, they feel that these top 12 teams or top 25 teams in this order would make sense when it comes to the seeding for the college football playoff.
Yeah. And it does make sense in a way. Boise State dropping 1 spot. They're still going to stay in the bracket at 12. I know there's a lot of scenarios that put them maybe even getting a bye if they win out. So it makes sense if you start to look at what they consider to make sense to them. To me, I think that they're counting losses too heavily. Like if you lost a game to a good team, they're considering that on your resume where there's teams that haven't lost at all.
Yeah.
So I'm a little confused on some stuff. I'm starting to understand their reasoning though on things, and I don't have to agree with it, but
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you, right? We're in the season of the year where we're talking about good losses, losing in general versus going undefeated and strength of schedule. Like those are the 4 or 5 terms you're going to hear for the next couple of weeks, and there's like 2 or 3 weeks left in the regular season. When I'm looking at this, I think about the G5. Let's go back to that. You talked about Boise State falling to 13. I think there's this like overarching thing and thought that the G5 spot has to be 12, or maybe they get the first round bye. There's a reality where Boise State could get a 7 or an 8 seed, especially as a lot of these teams in the SEC and in the ACC, potentially in the Big Ten, start to cannibalize themselves, right? If Boise State wins dominantly against San Jose State, a common opponent for Washington State, who's also ranked, and they win out and then they win their conference, it'd be tough to put like a 2 or 3 loss SEC team above a 1 loss conference champ Mountain West team in Boise State to me.
Yeah, and I'm going to take it a step further with Boise State and what I think that they have potential to do right now. I mean, per ESPN, FPI, and what they're looking at with these teams' strength of schedule going forward, Boise State, if they win out, ESPN's giving them an 81% chance to get a bye, not even to get the G5 spot. They're saying a Big 12 champ might get bumped to a later spot, maybe an ACC champ, depending on what happens with Clemson and Pitt, if SMU drops a game or Miami drops another game. And I think it's looking like a Big 12 championship that's won by a Kansas State or it's won by a Colorado would give Boise State the bye. If BYU wins out, it would be Boise State wouldn't get that. So Boise State, I think at this point, it's good to make the playoffs. They're heavily projected to win the rest of their games in season. I think that they're kind of playing for a bye now.
I think they're definitely playing for a bye. And, I completely agree with you. Like exactly what you said is what I was going to say in terms of if it's not BYU and it's Colorado or Kansas State, it might seem like a slap to the face to the commissioner over there at the Big 12. But I think the type of season Boise State's having, if they run the table with the 1 loss, they could find themselves in that bye spot. And if that happens, right, I'm sure Colorado, a conference champ, or Kansas State, a conference champ, if it's not BYU, would find themselves within the 5 to 8 seeding range. They're not going to be completely disrespected and find themselves between 9 and 12, but it is a definitely interesting scenario. On the other side of the G5, we have Tulane entered the CFP rankings. Army moved up 1 spot. So I think they're going to be watching the San Jose State, Boise State game very closely, watch how the season goes. So if Boise State drops another game or drops in the conference championship, that's a spot where most likely Army and Tulane are going to be playing in the conference championship for the American. And so they have an opportunity to kind of get that final group of 5 spot over a Boise if things happen. And if it is one of those 2 teams, I think they are a lock at the 12 seed, I will say. I think Boise's the only team that has the ability to get like a 10 seed or a top 4 seed, if you will.
Yeah, and they likely need a Boise State loss. Army, I think, is in the best position from a later team. I think they're sitting better than a Washington State, better than a Tulane, because they do have the opportunity to play Notre Dame. That would be a huge resume booster. They would jump heavily in the rankings if they win that game, because they're undefeated right now. I think the
Yeah.
only reason that they're sitting at 24 is strength of record up to this point, the strength of schedule that they've played. They notch a top 10 win. All of a sudden, their resume looks better than Indiana. Their resume
Yeah.
looks better to me than Penn State, looks better than Texas.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get to the Big Ten resumes. It's something I was looking at when we were prepping for this episode. But you started talking about Boise, and I wanted to kind of get the G5 bit because I love it this year. Coming from a former G5 school in Houston, I like to see that there's 3 teams in it, and they're not just playing for a bowl game spot. They're playing truly for a playoff spot to go against the big boys. I think the competition is much better this year compared to last year. Liberty, no shade to Liberty, or full shade, however you want to take it. But when you look at the top 10. This is an SEC podcast, so we got to take it back to the SEC. The committee thinks that Texas, Tennessee, and Alabama are the top 3 teams in the SEC. That doesn't automatically mirror the standings, but that's what they think in terms of the top 10. What were your thoughts on some of the rankings when it comes to the SEC teams and what we should expect going forward?
Yeah, for me in the SEC, I think that there's maybe a flip-flop between Texas and Tennessee. If we look at the resumes of these 2 schools, Texas's best win right now is Vanderbilt. It could have been a Michigan team if they didn't, drop the ball this year and perform as they did. Tennessee's best win, they beat Alabama. Yeah, they lost to Arkansas. This is where I'm talking about where the committee seems to be valuing who you lost to a lot more. But then you look at Notre Dame, one spot behind them, lost to NIU at home.
Right.
So I think that Tennessee should have been the highest ranked SEC team just based on the resume that they've put together. I think that they should have been higher than Texas. I know it's an SEC podcast. I do think that Indiana and BYU should both be higher than Texas as well, being undefeated and really having better wins.
Yeah.
I like Alabama at 10. I think Alabama 10, Ole Miss 11, Georgia 12 makes sense. Georgia at 12, it's so temporary because they're going to play Tennessee. I've been seeing a lot of people talk about this is an elimination game. If Tennessee loses this, they're out. I completely disagree. Tennessee loses this game per FPI. They're saying that they're about a 76% chance of making it. Georgia loses, it's over for them.
Yeah, and I was watching the college football playoff ranking show last night, and I think they had Heather from ESPN, and she was starting to make her case as should there be a 3-loss team making the playoffs. And I'm not saying it's not possible, but it is way too early to start that dialogue. I know we've been saying playoff elimination game the last couple of weeks. That's a fun feeling to say it, but it's a real thing, right? You should not be able to make the playoffs with over 2 quality losses unless you have a stacked quality win box. And there's only one team I think in the country that can have that ability, and that's Georgia. And to me, it's still if you only pass one of your 4 tests, that to me doesn't prove that you're a good team, especially if you look at some of the other quizzes, the Kentuckys, the Floridas, where you're not seeing as impressive a play. If you're dominant in your quizzes, you pass one test really well, which was Texas, and maybe you play some close test, I might give it to you. But I think the Tennessee game for me is definitely an elimination game, more specifically for Georgia than Tennessee. When it comes to the top 10, I'm in agreement with you. I think that I would make the case maybe even that Indiana deserves to be number 2. Look, Ohio State, their schedule's fine. They beat a good Penn State. They have a better quality win there. But I think at some point being undefeated in a Power 4 conference has to matter. And I was listening somewhere, and they're saying the Indiana schedule and the Georgia schedule from last year were very similar. The only difference is, the one team is Indiana, one's Georgia, right? Yeah. I just think that, given who Georgia had played in that SEC East schedule last season, there's a little bit of brand bias going on here. And of course, the rankings will sort themselves out that as these teams play, but they do matter in these timestamp moments because to me, I would put Indiana at 2. You could make the case for Ohio State at 3. I kind of agree with you putting Tennessee above Texas, but Texas has had more game control in their weaker SEC schedule. So to me, that should count for something as well.
Sure. Yeah. And again, it feels like spread watching a little bit. At some point, if you win the football game, you won the football game. And I think that that's hurting BYU a little bit. To me, I think BYU has the best case to be number 2 because they're undefeated. And when you're looking at who have these teams beat, yeah, Ohio State's beat Penn State. So I'll give them credit there. But if you're looking at Texas's strength of schedule, Indiana, Penn State, none of these have beat ranked teams. BYU has beat 2 teams in the top 16. They beat Kansas State. They beat SMU. So you have 2 top 16 wins right now. So you can't even say that BYU, not you, but the committee, you can't even say that BYU's strength of schedule isn't solid. They're winning ranked games.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, they have to kick a field goal at the end of the game. Okay, they have to go on a last-minute drive. It's winning football.
Right. It's winning football, and that's what you do against teams that are going to give you their best shot, right? Like BYU right now is the Texas Oklahoma of the Big 12. Every team is giving their best shot. I don't think a lot of teams really think that they're that legit. We saw it against Utah last week. A lot of teams have been playing neck and neck with this team, so they don't have that same like, ooh, we are the top dogs from an eye test, but they are the top dogs because everyone's giving their best shot. Fields are getting sold out, the likes. And so, another thing that I find interesting, and I had fun reading this one, when I look at the rankings, is watching teams that fall who didn't lose or didn't play. And so SMU fell from 13 to 14, if I'm not mistaken, at 8-1. And Boise fell from 12 to 13. This has been something historically the committee has done, right? Like there's a lot of teams that drop, and there's teams that they're thinking like, oh, I'm top 4 right now. TCU, Baylor, Ohio State plays a game. They didn't lose. Ohio State jumps them to 4, right? Florida State last year, they didn't lose a game. Bama did. Bama jumps them. Do you see any of those type of scenarios given, this kind of way too early review? And how do you feel about teams dropping that haven't necessarily lost a game?
Yeah, and I think it's half empty, half full. It's whether they dropped or whether a team did enough to jump in. And I think Ole Miss with the dominant win at Georgia did enough to jump in, and that's what caused this trickle effect of teams falling back. For that to happen again, with Texas only being one loss, if them and Texas A&M both win out to the point of their game, Texas A&M wins that game, that could be another one where Texas doesn't necessarily fall back far, but Texas A&M building that strength of resume that they have can maybe jump another few teams. Like they could jump SMU and Boise State again with a win there.
Yep. So you're thinking then the committee's basically saying this week that the ACC has one spot to get most likely. Do you think that that's fair?
It feels that way. I don't know if it should be that way. So if the rest of the season plays out, Miami wins out, SMU wins out, they play in the conference final game, and SMU wins that. Does that take Miami out of consideration? I don't know necessarily. Like, yeah, I mean they're putting one team in there. They dropped SMU, so yeah, I think that there's potential that they only do get one. I mean, it poses a good question though, and I wanted to bring this up with you. Is we talked about it a little bit before. Does a team that plays in their conference championship game and lose that game, does it hurt them as opposed to teams that are sitting at home that week? That's where that question gets answered a little bit. I mean, what do you think? You think it matters?
I think it does matter. I think that's a two-layered question, right? In terms of your resume, that loss, it's another sample size to see what you can do. It's the closest sample size to the playoffs. So it's like if this is the football you're playing right now, this is the football you're playing right now. On the other side, it's another game where you're risking injuries, right? We've seen it in the past where players have gotten hurt, even in bowl games. So that to me is a big factor. The third point is, hosting a home playoff game, depending on how your seeding is, might be more advantageous than going against the top team in your conference, the second best team in your conference, like especially if it's the SEC or the Big Ten. Like, if you're going against, if Oregon is playing Ohio State, if I'm Indiana, like I'm cool at home if it means I get to the playoffs in the first round and might even have a home playoff game. Down in Bloomington or up in Bloomington. So that's kind of my thoughts when it comes to that extra game. Now, should teams get penalized if they lose? I think it's on a case-by-case basis, and that seems like a ride in the fence answer. But if it's Miami, SMU, and those two teams, like one of those two teams has been kind of like winning closely all season. Statistically, they look great. Cam Ward, leads the nation in yards. If they lose that game, I'm going to have to look at some other resumes compared to SMU, right? But if it's two top Big Ten teams or two SEC teams, and it probably sounds biased, I think the loser would still get in personally.
Okay. Yeah, and I feel that way too because there's a lot of scenarios like there's a shot for Alabama to play Texas in the SEC championship game. Alabama doesn't have a lot of tests from here on out to boost their resume to get up past 10 without losses from other teams. But if it was a game like that, Alabama sitting at 10, they might sit at 9, depending on what happens with Georgia and Tennessee, and they lose that game. Do you push them out and then you shuffle in Ole Miss and Georgia behind them, even though they sat at home? It's like, how do you penalize a team for losing the conference game when everybody else is at home?
I think in that scenario, if Bama was to win, I think you have to give them the 2 seed or the 1 seed for another strong win. If they're to lose, you can push them to the back of the rankings in the top 12. But to me, if you made your conference championship, you're two of the best teams in the toughest conference with 9 ranked teams. Like, how are you going to leave out the second best team in a 9 ranked team conference? And
Right.
Missouri or South Carolina may fall out this week because one of those teams has to lose in that game. But the SEC will probably finish with 6 or 7 ranked teams in the conference. And so, if you're one of those top 2 teams in the conference championship and you lose, even if it puts you to your 3rd loss, and it's
Yeah.
Texas, I probably would put them in at least between 10 and 12.
Okay. Yeah, I think the only 3-loss team that could get in at this point is LSU. I think they're the only 3-loss team that has a shot to make the playoffs in my mind, and that's because there is a path for LSU to make the SEC championship game still. So if
Yep.
they were to win that, that would be the only way in. I don't think a 3-loss team regular season gets in. But yeah, there's an opportunity, I think, because SEC has so many 2-loss teams that
Yeah.
if you're going to put 4 in, you can't
Yeah.
take one out that's in the top 2.
Exactly. And we saw that a couple years ago with it was LSU was playing Georgia. I think they had 2 losses, but they had a couple quality wins in conference. That was the year that they had beat Bama. And Georgia absolutely dominated them in the SEC championship. But in that scenario, more or less auto bid, if they beat Georgia and you won the SEC, you don't leave out an SEC champ in a 14 playoff. That's just like the committee's clearly shown that, right? Even
Yeah.
when there was 5 power conferences, the SEC was never the one that was the odd team out. It damn near got 2 teams in sometimes.
Yeah.
So in that scenario, I agree. LSU, if you win the conference, you've earned it. You've gotten to the championship and you've played against another top team again. I definitely agree with you there.
Yeah.
Some of these playoff matchups, that's always fun to talk about, hypothetical, because although these are probably not going to happen, it is fun. A couple that stood out to me was Alabama traveling to Bloomington to play Indiana. That would be quite a game. Both teams have similar colors. I know we have the color police here at the New SEC podcast, so let me be careful. But similar colors for those 2 teams. If you're Alabama and it played out that way, like, would you be licking your chops, or are you a little worried playing this Signetti team, who's obviously well coached?
I think from a team standpoint, you're happy to play Indiana. If you look at the other ones that it could have been Ohio State, Penn State, or Tennessee. I think you got the best draw of that with Indiana. Now, December in Indiana, January Indiana, like, it's going to be cold. It's going to be snowing. So Alabama's going to have to figure out where they're going to go practice to get a little snow on the mitts. But yeah, I think that's the best matchup if you're an Alabama team, the most favorable.
I agree. The Tennessee Notre Dame one was also interesting to me. Tennessee's defense is really, really strong. I think probably the strongest defense that Notre Dame would face this season if it played out that way in the first round.
Yeah.
And so that was another one that kind of stood out to me.
Yeah, Notre Dame at this point, I'm not sure what Notre Dame's done to be 8, because we got to look at their loss, and I think they have the worst loss of all 25. And their win came in week 1 to Texas A&M, and that's kind of what's carrying them. We've seen a lot of recency bias in the rankings, and they're hanging on to that. So I'm not sure what Notre Dame's done.
They're doing just enough to not fall, right? Like, and especially if you look at the rankings in terms of who's left, it's like, why can't the Notre Dame spot be an SMU who's got 1 loss, or why can't that be a Boise State with 1 loss? You can make the case for Washington State. Like, I was looking at their resume, and right now they're Pac-12. There's only 2 teams. The challenge for Washington State is they only play a couple power conference teams. They did beat Washington this year. Washington's not that great. They're going to play Oregon State. Oregon State's 4-5 right now, so it's not really helping them. And they lost to Boise State, so they basically need Boise to lose to have a shot to get in. But there's a couple other 1-loss teams that are similar to Notre Dame. They just don't have an A&M win in week 1 against Connor Wegman. And they don't have the gold plated helmets.
Yeah, I think Miami, where we see the recency bias, I think Miami should be ahead of Notre Dame, because if you're going to look at resume and you're going to look at the 1 loss, Miami's loss is considerably better in my eyes to a Georgia Tech team, not on the road, by the way, not an IU team at home. So it's some recency bias coming in there. Miami still controls their destiny, so it is what it is. But
yeah. It's tough too, because to me it's better versus resume.
Yeah,
and every team, depending on where they're seated, I'm like, did you guys go off of who you think is better, guys and gals, or did you go off of who has a better resume? To me, Georgia is not the 12th best team in the country. Like, you could make a case they could be higher. The challenge is, of course, they lost to Bama and they lost to Ole Miss, so they're always going to have to be stacked under those 2 teams, unless those 2 teams lose another game.
To an extent, yeah. I mean, we put that out there last week, that if you beat a team, you're likely going to be ahead of them with the same ranking. We did see South Carolina ahead of LSU this week. So same record, LSU did win that game. So not necessarily, like, if you have a better resume or looking at recency bias, LSU getting smoked in their loss last week, that there is an opportunity to get ahead of a team that you lost to with a similar record. Although
Yep.
last week I didn't think that that was the case.
Yeah, I agree with you. Do you think that Ole Miss, who jumped 5 spots, one of the biggest jumps when it comes to the SEC, do they have an opportunity to get any higher than 11 based upon just winning alone and the teams winning in front of them?
The games, Florida, Mississippi State, I'm not sure they can get higher by themselves. Now with Georgia playing Tennessee, there's an opportunity there. With Tennessee falling out, does Georgia pass Ole Miss? It could be one where we just see them shift up one. So you see Alabama at 9, Ole Miss at 10, Georgia at 11. So there's a chance there for them to get higher. I don't think that they can get all the way up to anything, to get a home game, for example.
I get you. I get that. And hey, like that was a massive jump for them. Like taking down Georgia last week, you were literally in the hospital room and someone put the defibrillator on you and just woke you back up, because now you're back in it. You're in the hunt, and it's a completely different season. Jackson Dart's top 3 in the nation in yards, and Ole Miss could be a tough team to play in the first round if it plays out that way. So that's a good. So to your original hypothetical, is it better to be in the conference championship or to be on the outside? Like if you're sitting cozy between 5 and 9, they're at 11. It might be better to be on the outside than, being so good you have to go play another game.
Yeah.
Which is an opportunity for teams to get more film on you, for injuries to happen, travel, another week. I mean, the playoffs this year is a month long. Like I sent you the calendar of the whole schedule. It's December 20th to January 20th. It's a 4-week playoff. There's a week gap or 2-week gap between the semifinals and the final, but still it's a grueling season.
It is for sure. There's gonna be a lot of shakeup. I mean, a lot of these teams are going to move around. I think to wrap up here, a couple of games that have implications this week. We talked about Colorado controlling their destiny to make it to the Big 12 championship game. They play Utah. They're 11.5 point favorites in this one. And then we look at Clemson and Pittsburgh. It's interesting to think that this is a game that really matters, but they're sitting at 3 and 4 in the ACC. They're the next 2 up should someone lose again from Miami or SMU. SMU undefeated in conference play, but they're next up. So that game matters for who maybe is going to be the next one that could make it to that conference championship game.
That game definitely matters, and Pitt fell out of the rankings this week, so they're hungry to get back in that race. For SMU to take on BC. When we look at the top 10 or top 12, Georgia Tennessee is probably the number 1 game noodle mover. Oh my God. Tennessee, Georgia is the number 1 game to move the needle when it comes to these top 12 standings. I would say Penn State and Ohio State are playing 2 teams where the spread's over 28 last time I checked. And so I think with Northwestern and Purdue, if I'm not mistaken, for the teams they're playing. But those are some of the top games, as you mentioned, to round out this upcoming week that could impact the rankings. And I keep mentioning it, but Boise State, San Jose State's 6-3. They took Washington State to overtime, so that can't sleep on San Jose State.
No, they're big games. Georgia, Tennessee, like you mentioned, most likely people are looking at it as a playoff elimination game. With a loss, Tennessee looking at about 76%. With a loss, Georgia looking at about 45%. So there's still a path for Georgia to get in. They need a couple of losses ahead of them. But this will be one that to definitely keep eyes on. It will be a topic of conversation in the committee room next week.
Definitely. It definitely will be a topic. And, all the Dogs fans are watching the tracker in terms of their odds very closely. And so thank you for joining us. This is the Brackets and Buzz segment. Every week, we're going to bring you CFP talk. We only have a couple more weeks left of this before conference championship week. So still another week of playoff talk. But this has been fun. Hunter, any final thoughts?
Some good football ahead. Keep moving Army on up. Rank the Service Academy.
I'm here for it. Veterans Day was on Monday. Keep it going. And so thank you, everyone who tuned in. This is a new SC podcast, and this is Brackets and Buzz, baby.